This is a Tab Media special report on preparing now for the needed conversations that will come after the 2023 SBC Annual Meeting in New Orleans. I'm your host, Jennifer Rash. Joining me is George Bullard, longtime denominational leader in national, state convention, and associational positions. George, thanks for joining me today to chat and talk about this.
Jennifer, I'm very glad to talk about it because I believe so much in the Southern Baptist movement and the positive impact it can have if done well.
Makes sense. Well, predictions are that the messenger count for the 2023 annual meeting will be roughly a third of the messengers who showed up in Dallas in 1985. That was the historic annual meeting that we all turn back to just learn and grow from. And I think that's where you're kind of mentioning this important moment to learn from history. I've enjoyed hearing some of your commentary on that, and especially like how you referenced the Mark Twain quote, where it's not necessarily history repeating itself, but maybe rhyming. So I'd like for you to start there and just kind of help us understand what you mean about rhyming and why we should think about just learning from the past.
Well, obviously, during the 1980s, there were just a whole bunch of issues that kept coming up at every repetitive state convention. And you referenced the 1985. And yes, I was one of those 45,000 people who were there in Dallas in 1985. But what happened to me in my role was that I was training associational directors of missions, now AMSs, and their staff in conflict mediation with congregations, all throughout the 80s and into the early 1990s. And the question that kept coming up, particularly during the 1980s, was how do we handle the conflict that occurs inevitably when our pastors and staff people return from the Southern Baptist Convention, all pumped up about various issues, and they play that out in their congregations, and within a month or so, we're getting all these requests for help with conflict in our congregations.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you saw that really played out.
It really did. Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess I was saying about the rhyming is that I wondered if with the plethora of issues that we have coming up at the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in New Orleans, that if it isn't rhyming with the 1980s. And that in the grassroots and our associations that we need to be positive and proactive in terms of being prepared for response to anything that might come out of the convention this year and that is likely to come out of successive conventions, because these issues are not all going to be solved next week.
That makes sense. And there is an existing divisiveness that's showing up, and that seems to be prepped and ready to grow even. And like you said, these issues may continue. So if you are an associational leader, then is that the spot that kind of mixes the best, because you've got your church congregation, your church leader, and they are doing their work in their local area, and they're the main point of what we do anyway. And then you've got all this stirring around us. So is that associational spot? Is that what you're saying is the best place to come together and process afterward?
Well, in the association is where you have the deepest number and the greatest number of primary relationships of churches to churches.
Okay.
And while some churches focus on their association, some churches don't, still in the interaction and in the chatter that can happen in a county, in a city, in a metropolitan area, the association fellowship of churches becomes sort of a focus of that. And so, yes, that is a place where because relationships in an association at their best are family relationships, they're primary relationships, they're deep emotional relationships. That is a place for us to have a proactive and positive, as I've said, addressing of these kinds of issues. And how do we dialogue together, because we have such a greater mission in fulfilling the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, and we don't need to allow the issues discussed by 1/10% of Southern Baptists in the annual meeting to disrupt what God has called us to do.
Okay, so positive and proactive. How do we do that?
Well, I think our tendency is that we don't want to get involved in divisive issues at all. And I'm not suggesting that associations take positions on any of the issues that come out of the Southern Baptist Convention. That's not necessarily the direction I would head. But we have to have dialogue uh, rather than debate. We have to have dialogue that helps us to look um, at a 360-degree view of what these issues are, what these issues mean, and how they play out. And so we've got to provide a forum where that can happen. Because again, we have to remember that it is a small minority
Mhm.
of the pastors and staff members and key lay leaders from any of our churches who will be in New Orleans. And so they will be feeling the heat, but not necessarily understanding the emotion of those who were present.
That makes sense. Um, okay, so dialogue versus debate. In the culture that we're in now, and as toxic as so many of the conversations become, how can we help our groups walk into the room and be prepared to understand a common respect, of being able to discuss and share different opinions and not demonize someone because they might be just even asking a question or trying to understand. Is is there something that we can do to prepare the hearts of those who will come into that meeting and just to be ready?
Well, first of all, it has to be a prayerful dialogue,
Mhm.
and as opposed to a debate. Debates usually are debates of people about the personal positions that they hold. Prayerful dialogues are more about the principles that are at play, excuse me, in a particular dialogue.
Mhm.
So, therefore, um, what needs to be set up is a situation where we try to look at the issues at play and how they might impact local congregations by taking a look at what the principles are here.
Mhm.
What are at least three different ways of looking at things. One of the things about a debate is the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the positive and the negative. But a
Mhm.
dialogue seeks to look at things from at least three different perspectives and
Mhm.
try to say where is there truth,
Mhm.
where is there love, where is a relationship that will allow us to work in unity to fulfill the Great Commission and the spirit of the Great Commandment.
Mm. That makes sense. That makes sense. So if okay, so if an association leader decides this is what I want to do, but there's an uncomfortable level of being able to manage this, would this be a time to bring in someone who could be a unbiased, no someone who could just help lead, or is it a case where maybe just a little bit of work on the person's part could be
Mm.
ready and just say, okay, I'm not going to go in there with a fight. I'm not ready to fight or argue this point. Let's, to pull out those pieces of the three sides.
I think preparation is important.
Hmm.
We do have to acknowledge that the debate that has been occurring and the polarization that has been occurring, not only in our secular society, but also within our denomination, uh, does mean that sometimes a third party is needed. But I think in the typical association, it can be handled internally.
Okay.
Now, if they desire to have an outside moderator of the prayerful dialogue, that would make sense. Certainly, the associational mission strategist should never play a role other than moderator. They should not be one of the key presenters. But I would recommend that we look at three different ways to have the dialogue, or three different principles in the dialogue.
Okay.
One of them is the principle of the box, if I could say it that way.
Okay.
A boxed approach would be to say, well, these are all the right answers. This is the way a real Southern Baptist who agrees with all that's going on at the Southern Baptist Convention ought to see these things.
Okay.
The second would be, no, these are the essentials. We're about keeping the main thing, and these are the essentials. And most of these other things are secondary dialogues.
Hmm.
The third, which is actually the most radical, would be the one that says, well, there's not a box and there's not a center because we're all local church autonomous Baptists. And so each church ought to be able to believe and understand and play out its practice in a Baptist tradition, but as they feel led by God's Holy Spirit. What I would hope is that it would be possible to ask 3 pastors within the association, one of which would take each of one of the perspectives, even if it's not their perspective, that they would agree to do some role playing, and that they would think, and even the 3 pastors maybe even have dialogue with one another before this prayerful dialogue about, okay, I'm going to approach it from this perspective, you're going to approach it from this perspective, you're going to approach it from this perspective. And so that we all are stretched in terms of seeing the different ways that that we ought to take a look at this. Now, there would need to be a time at the end where each pastor should feel free to state their personal perspective, their personal convictions about it. So you're not asking them to compromise anything, but you're asking them to stretch people and cause them to think about these issues in a way that they typically wouldn't think about them. Otherwise, if all we see is that we've got the right answer, this is the only way to look at it, then it's unlikely that we will, with our sister and brother congregations, be able to figure out how we increase our unity for the mission that God has given us.
That makes sense, because I can see where that there could be a ripple effect, that if whatever decisions are made or are not made, there would be this temptation to come in and start evaluating each other and seeing
Right.
who fits now in this new world, if there is such a thing or whatever happens. So I'm hearing, I think the people who would need to be on the platform speaking they should have been in the meeting in New Orleans. Would that be better, or to have
Well,
that
now
emotional side,
that's
or
another,
no?
yeah, that's an interesting thought. The answer is not necessarily,
Okay.
because just
Okay.
because I don't go to New Orleans doesn't mean I don't have opinions.
Right. So they
And
could be studied up enough, though, right?
that's correct. And that kind of that pre-meeting between these 3 pastors
Okay.
and
Okay.
the associational mission strategist, and if you're going to use an outside third party to moderate, those 4 or 5 people getting together and kind of talking through, now how are we going to do this? Because another part of the issue is, and the deeper one that was in what I've been writing about will, the New Orleans meeting rhyme from the 1980s,
Right.
is that I'm concerned about how pastors and staff people handle this within their local church.
Right. Right.
Because unless 80+% of their lay leadership is already decided on issues like this, which is very doubtful, because there are enough different kinds of issues that are coming up that they won't necessarily be. Pastors and staff people can get into a sticky situation in their own churches. So part of the prayerful dialogue, in addition, we haven't really talked about prayer yet,
Right.
ought to be, talking through, well, process-wise, how are we going to handle this debate or this dialogue? Let me stay with that word, in our local church. And of course, some churches are going to say, my church doesn't know about these issues, and I'm not planning to introduce it to them.
I do hear that a lot.
Yeah, yes. So that, but the religious and secular press will be sharing these issues, and so there will be some lay people, at least, that'll have questions.
Mm. Well, okay, so prayer, you mentioned prayer, and we have not talked about that. Okay, outline that, flesh that out for me.
Well, I think part of the gathering that could occur post the Southern Baptist Convention, of course, when people get back in their association, hopefully within the first 30 days after the end of the New Orleans meeting, ought to also be to seek the will of God.
Mhm.
How should we play this out in our churches and association, both in individual churches and in our relationship with one another?
Mhm.
Perhaps this is a good point to additionally say that we have to always remember that an association is an organism and not an organization. And so what's happening here, the organization called the Southern Baptist Convention is making decisions. But
Mhm.
we are the ones in the association who have to deal with it more spiritually and emotionally on a day-to-day basis. And
Mhm.
so our value is not in helping our churches and association decide who's right about all the issues. Our value is about having healthy, helpful, life-generating, spiritually focused dialogue.
Mm. Okay. Okay. So don't run back home from New Orleans and start just running around screaming and yelling about whatever it was. Take some time. Um, okay. So how to plan? Okay. We're just days out, but should we put something on the calendar for 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out? What's a perfect time to come home, process, think on it, read about it? I hope you're reading your state Baptist papers, but read about what's happening and then be ready to have this dialogue. What's your sweet spot on the timing?
I could hope for many associations who would desire to be proactive and do this, that they could do it by the last week of June.
Okay. So while it's still
Because once
fresh
we
and
get into July, yeah, it's still fresh. Once we get into July and people start scattering, it'll be more difficult to get people back together. I think it would be good to start thinking about who are those 3 pastor leaders that
yeah.
could serve on the panel, that could take the boxed or the centered, or the third one is actually called fuzzy because there is no box or center. And by the way, this is not just some kind of business understanding. I would pause at this moment and say there's a missiologist, anthropologist from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s until his death, named Paul Hebert, who talked about the church in regard to those 3 different understandings of a box set, a centered set, and a fuzzy set. And he's got some really helpful understandings in some of his writing that we really kind of need to understand, that we as Baptists have swung in all 3 places over our history since 1609. And so that's a part of who we are. But yes,
Yeah.
I would do some thinking ahead if I were an AMS about who are the people, where could it be held, when should it be held, how can we prepare for it, what's the date, who should we invite. And as you talk about state papers and writing and that kind of thing, there ought to be a story written. So there ought to be a storyteller at this gathering who would summarize what came out of it, because it's unlikely there would be a majority of the pastors and staff people there. There will be a representative group of people there in terms of what's happening. So those are some of my thoughts at this point.
I love that. I love that. Well, we will put the challenge out for the AMSs, the directors of missions, associational leaders, to be thinking about this, be prayerful, go ahead and be proactive, put this on the calendar, be thinking about your 3 pastors to put on the panel, and then report back. Let us know how it goes, and let's see if we can maybe not rhyme with history in this sense.
Yeah.
All right, George. Well, thank you for helping us with that. I look forward to following up with you on some other topics, and also to find out how our associational leaders did with this particular topic. So.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for the opportunity to share this information and to get the word out there and to encourage this kind of dialogue.
Absolutely.